Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning back in for episode 2 of Young Constitutionalists. My name is Nathan Jones, and I will be talking today about socialism and how Americans' view of socialism is flawed and how socialism can be described as a cancer. First of all, let me talk about what socialism is. Socialism is essentially the action of taking a little bit of everyone's money to provide services for everyone. Basically, sharing. Now, in and of itself, it doesn't sound all that bad. It's giving the rich giving to the poor, the government providing for those less fortunate. It doesn't sound like necessarily a bad thing. But let me talk a little bit more about what socialism actually does. Now, socialism is considered very left-wing, and I'll get into the political spectrum in just a minute, but it requires a high amount of government control. Now, what happens when we have a high amount of government control? Well, people are oppressed. There's a lot of corruption that goes on when we have a high amount of government control. Now, let's talk about different brands of socialism first. We have what we hear most of the time, socialism. It doesn't necessarily sound like a bad, negative connotation when you mention socialism. Like, oh, sharing. It's a form of government that works, or something like that. Well, let me go into that in a little more depth. You think socialism? You think fascism? Nazism? Communism? Does that all sound so good anymore? Well, now let me take a look at what famous Russian leader Vladimir Lenin said. The ultimate goal of socialism is communism. The Russians can assist our elected leaders by giving us little doses of socialism until we find out that we actually have communism. Communism. What is communism? Can anyone possibly own private property in a communist system? No, you have no rights to property, no rights to life or liberty, and you can't pursue happiness necessarily because you don't own anything. Everything's owned by the government. The government decides what you do, how you run your business. So let's unpack those a little bit more. Mussolini was a fascist. He was very oppressive. You talk about the Italians who lived under Mussolini. It was a horrible system, and it was all about government regulating businesses. Nazism, same sort of thing. I want to point out a specific example with this one because it's very applicable here in the United States. Volkswagen. I call them Hitlermobiles. It's because Volkswagen was nationalized by Germany, meaning that the company was owned by the German federal government. So you bought a Volkswagen? Well, you're providing business to the federal government, essentially. Here in the United States, we have companies like General Motors, the big famous one, Chrysler, another one. They accepted the government's bailouts. They are nationalized by the federal government, and so you buy a brand new Chevrolet, brand new Buick, brand new Dodge, and you are providing business to the federal government because the federal government owns those businesses. How can that possibly be fair if, the federal government's bailing out these businesses that were going bankrupt? Why? Let the free market take care of it. GM and I'll point out GM specifically because they're the ones most known for going bankrupt in 2008 and getting bailed out in 2009. They had bad business practices, and that's what got them bankrupt. They deserve to go bankrupt from the actions that they were doing. The CEO, I could go into car talk here, but there were bad decisions that just broke the system down. They were going bankrupt. The government came and bailed them out, and now guess who owns GM? Uncle Sam. So that's Nazism right there. Classic Nazism. And communism, fascism, socialism, they're all the same thing. They're all synonymous. People like to use different terms and give their brand of socialism, like, oh, this is good. Communism works. It's just no one has done it correctly yet, is the saying. And so they brand their socialism with different words, and it's the same thing. Always ends badly. So, let's look at how socialism is a cancer. Well, socialism, it says, well, if we take from the rich, give to the poor, essentially, we'll have a bigger middle class. And the bigger middle class is very important. Here in the United States, the middle class is huge. I come to a random person and ask, are you rich or are you poor? And the answer is probably usually going to be neither. No, I'm not poor. I'm not super rich either. I'm middle class. The United States has a huge middle class. Throughout history, there hasn't been a huge middle class. There's always been, kings and, nobles and people who have a lot of money. And then there's the very poor class. Well, what socialism does is it essentially makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. Take President Obama, for example. President Obama was a socialist. During his time in office, the government grew significantly. Guess where all the prosperous people were working? The government. So, you have socialism that shrinks the middle class because the poor are less able to support themselves, and the rich government people get rich off of it. They take the money, they spend it on whatever they want, fund different things that people don't necessarily agree with, and it destroys countries. Look at Venezuela, for example. Venezuela, a classic example of a country that is horrible. No one wants to live there. They started out as a capitalist nation. Socialism took over, and Venezuela's a bad, bad country. Same thing's happening here in the United States. Things have been a little bit better since the 2016 election, but we're definitely headed that direction. The most prosperous counties in the United States are around Washington, D.C. What does that tell you? So, socialism is... The United States has been the number one major roadblock to socialism and communism. But that's sliding. The communists want to get rid of us. They want to give us little doses of socialism until we wake up one day and find that we have communism. That's what's going to happen if we don't keep watching. So, socialism destroys the middle class, makes the rich richer, the poor poorer, and destroys nations. You look at any socialist nation, they're bankrupt. You look at a capitalist nation, they're making lots of money, and people who live there are very well-to-do. Singapore, very rich people who live there. They're capitalists. United States, the average American is very well-to-do compared to many countries. Capitalist. Ethiopia, people are very poor, there's disease, there's horrible stuff. Communist. Cuba, horrible economy, healthcare is awful, living conditions are awful. Communist. China. If you live in rural China, very, very poor economy, people are not making much money when they work. Slavery, essentially. Horrible things. China. Communist. The former Soviet Union. The list goes on and on and on. You look at a communist country and you find that people are oppressed and not happy and not making a lot of money, and the poor are poorer and the rich are richer. Happens every single time. Socialism never works, and it never will. The only way that economies can last is if it's free market capitalism. The fewer regulations on economic issues, the better the economy. Proves true every single time. That's why here in America, with more regulations because of bureaucrats making all these regulations that have the power of laws, prices have gone up. Inflation's happening. People are breaking the laws of economics and regulating the economy, which can only truly work when there are no regulations. So, socialism destroys countries. I've said this many times before, but socialism does not help the poor. It is not compassionate, nice sharing thing that, the Democrats will preach to you. It isn't. It ruins people's lives. So, to conclude, let's just talk about this a little bit. So, we have fascism, socialism, they're all socialists. They're all the same. Why do we have things like fascism on the right wing? And why do people think that Republicans are fascists? Well, let me talk about this a little bit. So, Joseph Stalin was the one who came up with that. Joseph Stalin was a socialist, communist. He did not want to be associated with people like Adolf Hitler, a Nazi, or Benito Mussolini, fascist. So, he said, well, this fascism and the Nazism, they're all right-wing governments, whereas socialism, we're left-wing, we're the good guys here. Well, let me talk about the political spectrum. Left-wing is total government control. Right-wing is no government control. We have fascism, socialism, communism, Nazism, anything, you name it. It's all on the left. And, conservatism, Republicans for the most part, Constitutionalists, we're all on the right. We believe in very little government control because we know that the government kills people. The people who live under strong, oppressive governments are the most oppressed people in the world. The government, socialist governments, have killed more people than the Black Plague ever did. So, as Americans, let's stop the growth of socialism and get the truth out there. Thanks for watching.